Please join me in welcoming our speakers, Ian Parker, who is a psychoanalyst and is working in Manchester. And we've also got David Pavon-Cuellar, who is professor in the faculties of psychology and philosophy at the Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolas de Hidalgo in the city of Morelia in Mexico. David and Ian and David, as part of the discussion, they're going to share reflections on questions that include the necessity or impossibility of revolution, the connection between psychoanalysis, conflict, and revolution. And they're also going to discuss with us, what they think psychoanalysis and revolution can teach communities, community activists, human rights defenders, and more. And psychoanalysis and revolution itself, the full title is Psychoanalysis and Revolution, Critical Psychology for Liberation Movements. It is a manifesto by Ian Parker and David Pavon-Cuellar, who, drawing on psychoanalysis, argue for connecting social transformation with personal liberation. With that as our introduction, if you could tell us more about yourself, what you do, where you do it, why you do it, and how it all started.
Okay.
Sorry about
hello, Comrade David. It's really good to have you here as well. Okay, I work as a psychoanalyst in Manchester in the north of England. And I trained as a psychoanalyst sometime after I started working as a lecturer in psychology. One of the peculiar things about psychology in the English-speaking world is that it has a very strange image of what psychoanalysis is. Often, psychoanalysis is taught in psychology courses as if it is a non-science joke sometimes. And we like to say that a lot of psychologists are dead, but Freud seems more dead than the rest of them. And so I was also interested in why that was the case, and also a little bit worried that some radical psychologists who were looking for an alternative to mainstream psychology turned to psychoanalysis, and they treated psychoanalysis as a kind of religion, and they became evangelistic about it. And in that way, the psychoanalysis turned into something that was almost as bad as the psychology that they wanted to escape. So I kept away from psychoanalysis for many years. I didn't see it as being radical at all. And it was only when I started to have contact with comrades in other countries that I started to realize that psychoanalysis was very different in different places, and that genuine psychoanalysis was very different from psychology. That it's not concerned with strengthening the ego and making us feel good in ourselves, but it's actually about questioning who we are as human beings and how we've become the particular kind of people that we've become, how we absorb messages about what it is to be a good little boy or girl, and how it is to be a good citizen, and what we should feel and how we should speak about our feelings. Psychoanalysis isn't about making us into good, well-behaved citizens, but psychoanalysis has always been about questioning who we are and questioning the social relations that make us who we are. It gives us space for people to speak about that. And that's why I started training as a psychoanalyst, and I learned more about what was happening in other parts of the world. And it's that contact with the international scope of psychoanalysis that has been so crucial to rethinking what psychoanalysis is and what psychoanalysis could be. And my contact with David is part of that learning experience for me.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, David.
Yes, I'm David Pavon-Cuellar. I live in Morelia, a small university town in western Mexico. I am a professor at a public university, the Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás de Hidalgo, traditionally located on the left of the political spectrum. I teach psychology and psychoanalysis of both kinds, the one of which Ian was talking a minute ago, and another kind of psychoanalysis, a more politically engaged psychoanalysis. And I also teach psychology, but with a critical orientation, emphasizing the various ways in which our subjectivity is constituted, dominated, mutilated, and destroyed by capitalism, patriarchy, and coloniality. My students are mostly from popular classes. They are children of indigenous people, peasants, and workers. Most of them, of the students, work and sometimes we find ourselves, my students and I, participating in the same movements. I was more politically active when I was young, first in Maoism, then in Zapatismo, finally in various communist organizations, depending on the country in which I was living. Currently, my at university leaves me little time for militancy, but I participate in the teachers' union and belong to various radical left groups or collectives. I still consider myself a communist, and I'm also a Marxist.
I suppose that's something that we have in common, me and David, is that we're both communists, we're both Marxists, and we're both trying to work with psychoanalysis to find a radical way of working with it, emphasizing its radical history and its radical potential. Though we do come from different political traditions, as David said, he comes from a Maoist tradition, and I come from a Trotskyist tradition, which is the way of things in most of the far left in Britain at the moment. So there are different ways of connecting those two distinct political traditions with psychoanalysis that are sometimes have been useful, but have sometimes led us astray as well. So we've kind of learned from each other as we've discussed those different connections with far left politics, with Marxist politics.
And thinking about psychoanalysis and revolution, how did the idea for the book come about, for the manifesto? How did it come about?
Well, I was at a conference with David in Havana, in Cuba, in 2019, and David suggested that there should be a very short introduction to psychoanalysis that could be published in Latin America. And I said, well, that sounds like a good idea, but I really would like to co-write it with you, David, because it's not something I feel I could do on my own. And also because of the quite different contexts in which we're working. I think there's something problematic about someone who is in a colonial country, speaking about psychoanalysis internationally. And I think the book should be co-authored. And then after we decided to write a book that was more oriented explicitly to liberation movements and to connect with left-wing ideas that are really important to us. After we decided to do that, the pandemic hit. And so we didn't meet again for some time. We did all of the writing online, with the text going backwards and forwards between Manchester and Morelia, and eventually arrived at a text that we were happy with. So it was a very difficult process, as that time was for most people, but it meant that we were focusing on the text and thinking about how to clarify the ideas.
How about you, David? What was the experience like for you?
Yes, I would like to add some things. I received first the explicit request to write the manifesto from a Mexican group that has one of the best committed left-wing publishers in Spanish. I thought that Ian would be the perfect person to write this book. So when I met Ian in Havana, in Cuba, I made him the proposal, and he proposed me to do this together. It was an honor for me and a pleasure. It was Ian who conceived the structure of the book. First, Ian wrote, and I completed his writing with my words, phrases, and paragraphs. This process was repeated 2 or 3 or even 4 times. It was truly a joint work. There is not a single...
Oh dear, David's disappeared. I think he was going to say that there isn't a single idea in the book that wasn't worked on by both of us, and that's certainly true. Maybe I should say something about the concepts that we talk about in the book and how we chose those, because that is sometimes misleading to some people. What we wanted to do in the book was to talk about psychoanalysis in general, psychoanalysis not only of a one particular theoretical tradition, but psychoanalysis as it's practiced by many different psychoanalysts. As you might know, psychoanalysis is as divided as politics is, with followers of Melanie Klein, followers of Jacques Lacan, followers of the relational psychoanalysis strand of Winnicott, etc., etc. And those divisions are very deep and bitter divisions. So we wanted to write something very general that would be useful and interesting to all of the psychoanalysts, as well, of course, to political activists on the left of many different kinds, Marxists and anarchists, indigenous movements, feminists, trans and queer activists. So we had that in mind as well. But when we were thinking about the concepts for the book, we focused on 4 key concepts to structure the book. And David is just, I think, coming back in again now. And the 4 concepts that we talked about were the unconscious, which is, of course, you can't talk about psychoanalysis without talking about the unconscious. The drive, which is often confused with instincts in the psychological representations of psychoanalysis. So the unconscious and the drive, and then repetition, the ways in which we keep repeating things unknowingly and unwillingly, and driving ourselves into the same kind of situations all the time that are so self-destructive to us. And then finally, the 4th concept is transference. That is the ways in which all of these things are repeated in the clinic in relation to the psychoanalyst. And then there's an opportunity in the transference for those things to be noticed and worked through. That's why the transference is so important in the clinical work. But the little mistake I think I made, and then we both made, was that when we were talking about these 4 concepts, the unconscious, repetition, drive, and transference, we were also using the idea of 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis that was outlined by the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan back in 1964. And that leads some people to think that our book is a Lacanian book, that it's in the tradition of Jacques Lacan, which I suppose there is an element of truth in that, because we're both interested in Lacan, we're both Lacanians, but the book is written to be broader than that and to be more open than that. In the same kind of way, we're both Marxists, but the book is broader than that and not only confined to Marxism as a political strand. Hi, David. Welcome back.
Hi, David. And you were saying something before you lost connectivity. Would you like to continue and then dovetail with what Ian is saying?
Yes, of course. Did you listen my last answer or not? Not at all?
So go on, Ambrose. Sorry.
I think we got to the point where you were talking about meeting Ian and inviting him to write the book, and then we lost connectivity.
Perfect. So I will say two more things about that. So we met in Havana, and I made to Ian the proposal of writing the book, and he proposed me to do this together, and I accepted. Very happy. But it's important to say that the structure of the book was conceived by Ian, and I agreed with this structure of the 4 parts. First, Ian wrote, and then I completed his writing with my words, phrases, and paragraphs. And this process was repeated many times, first 2 or 3 times, but then we were discussing about some parts of the book. I want to emphasize that it was a truly joint work between Ian and me. There is not a single page, perhaps not a single paragraph, that is only from Ian or only from me. Each paragraph ties together phrases and words from both of us. The writing is always ours. It is a collective writing and not only his or mine. It is a writing in which something collective manifests itself, overcoming the difference between Ian and me, which are cultural, social, political, and generational difference. And his Trotskyism and my Maoism and his English British part and my Mexican part and our social familiar backgrounds are very, very different also. This is joining all this together, I think, was already a political act. Although Ian has much more experience and academic background than me, I was reading him when I was a student already 30 years ago. He was always respectful of my ideas and maintained a perfectly horizontal relationship with me. I think this is already a political gesture also. Concerning what Ian was saying, yes, there is this Lacanian part of the book, but I think when we begin to read the book, it's clear that it's an open book, and we criticize also the Lacanian perspective, and especially the lack of opening of Lacanian psychoanalysis as other currents of psychoanalysis to social, political problems, or the power relations that are established between psychoanalysis and society and politics. I think the book is an opening of psychoanalysis to liberation movements, but without putting itself in a position of power, knowledge, without attempting to guide social movements or advise them or interpret them or tell them their truth. On the contrary, it is about putting some fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis at the service of revolution and liberation. It is a book for militants and not for psychoanalysts. And I think both Ian and me, we have a better opinion of social movements and political organizations than our opinion about the psychoanalysis milieu of people.
I think you've already, in your response, you've already answered this question. But I'm curious about the whole range of influences that you are drawing on Marxism, Trotskyism, Lacan, Freud, and I think you also have an argument with Young as well. How does can you say something more about just these all these influences coming together in this book?
Maybe one way of starting is to say that we wanted to go back and take inspiration from the debates that had happened in psychoanalysis before the Second World War in Europe, when the psychoanalysts, many of the psychoanalysts were involved in communist or socialist movements of different kinds. And there were many political debates among the psychoanalysts, as well as theoretical debates. So what we learn from looking back to that history, for example, is that in contrast with psychoanalysis today, where many psychoanalysts believe that they should be working in private practice and that they should be charging a lot of money for their services, there was an initiative in Europe, in Budapest and in Vienna and Berlin, before the Nazis took power, of the free clinics. And the free clinics were an enterprise that made psychoanalytic treatment available to working class communities, and were explicitly geared to a left-wing understanding of society, of linking personal distress with social distress, and thinking about the ways in which personal change could link with social change. So those debates were not only theoretical debates, but they were political debates. That is, psychoanalysis at that time was very open and conflictual and contradictory. In a way, it was a collective enterprise. Yes, there was a problem that it was led by certain charismatic people, like Sigmund Freud himself, and then there was a temptation to pass the leadership down to powerful individuals. But there was also collective discussion, vibrant collective discussion that was also often very political. And that was destroyed by the Nazis in Europe when psychoanalysis was portrayed as being a Jewish science, as subversive. And that was one of the reasons why the Nazis closed it down, because it was seen as being subversive as well as being Jewish. And the psychoanalysts who were able to escape then had to adapt to the countries that they'd come to. And there's been some very interesting historical work on the way that psychoanalysis in the United States adapted to that culture, to that individualistic culture, to make people into successful individuals. And the psychoanalysts who had been on the left had to keep quiet about their political affiliations in Europe because they feared being deported. So they had to adapt to this society, and they changed psychoanalysis to be an adaptive approach to subjectivity rather than a critical approach to subjectivity. So what we're doing is kind of redeeming or retrieving that history of psychoanalysis as an authentic, collective, radical enterprise. So we take our bearings from the work of many psychoanalysts who stayed true to their radical politics and debated with each other about where we should go with it. And I hope that we've laid a space open for people to be able to argue about psychoanalysis and to take up different strands of the book and to find contradictions in the book and to open those up as well and to take those debates forward.
How about you, David?
Yes, I will add only that yes, we want to recover a tradition of a struggle and committed and progressive work in psychoanalysis. This is one of our objectives. And we also want to establish again this communication of psychoanalysis with social movements, political organizations, liberation movements in general, that has been caught because of different reasons. Two of them have been explained by Ian. I would also like to say that what psychoanalysis become in the Third Reich in Germany, in Nazi Germany, is strangely and similar to what psychoanalysis becomes. In both cases, it become a kind of adaptive psychology that wanted to control and avoid any kind of subjective subversion of the totalitarian projects that were in course both in the United States and in Germany, which, you know, after the Second World War and was not defeated at all. It was there was a kind of ideological victory of Nazism and fascism that which is evident now with what is happening in Gaza, for example. And it is against this defeat of movements that were cultural, intellectual, and not only social, political movement that were resistant Nazism, that we also want to recover psychoanalysis. There are many coincidences between Ian and I. We both are Marxists, even if we are in different traditions. We both are Leninists. Also, in psychology, we both work with critical psychology. We don't accept the psychologization of political and social problems, either in psychology or in psychoanalysis. And we think that what we are working with in psychology and psychoanalysis are political, social realities that must not be psychologized from an expert point of view. There were not, returning to your question, I don't remember to argue with Ian about important points in the book. There were more coincidences that points of disagree. Yes, we have some differences. Ian don't like very much liberation theology and religion in Latin America, and I love this. And but these differences were not important in the process of writing the book.
I should say that I have changed my mind a little bit through discussion with David about liberation theology. I was brought up in an atheist household. I was brought up to be very distrustful of anything religious, as if it was something pathological. And so I found it difficult for a long time to come to terms with the fact that there were movements in Latin America that were inspired by religion and tried to turn religion from being something that looked to a world outside and beyond this one, but were concerned with changing this world now, of looking at the opposition between good and evil as something that is operated in this world that people could be part of as active subjects. And so I have learned from that. And I suppose that's also important when I'm talking about psychoanalysis, to make it clear that I don't think psychoanalysis is the only way forward. Psychoanalysis is useful, and that's what we're talking about in this book. But I'm not an evangelist for psychoanalysis, and there are many other spaces for engaging in critical reflection on who we are and how we can change the world, including in some of the radical theology circles. Okay, so there's that. I wanted to say something about Jung, because you mentioned Jung, Ambrose. which is that we're open to many different kinds of psychoanalysis, but we don't see Jung as being a psychoanalyst. And I know there are some Jungians that we argue with who I think have been making an argument for Jung's work to be included in psychoanalysis, but I think there are very good reasons to be suspicious of Jung. The first reason is that when the Nazis took power and Freud and his followers were persecuted and hounded out of Germany and Austria and the other occupied territories, when some psychoanalysts, quite a few of them, ended up in the concentration camps, Jung agreed to take the leadership of the German Psychotherapy Society. And not only did he do that, but Jung talked about a collective unconscious that was also a racial unconscious, and made some really despicable statements about the Jews and black people contaminating the racial unconscious of the white race. And I think that that's not only a political mistake, but it's a theoretical mistake that flows from Jung's conception of what collectivity is. For Jung, collectivity is something that operates in a kind of the worst form of religious way that we're all part of, divided into different racial categories. And the aim of Jungian analysis is to heal the division between the conscious and the unconscious, and to allow one particular individual self to emerge from that process. So I think it's, in a way, although it talks about the collective unconscious, it's not concerned with collective action. It's about individuals realizing themselves. And I think the other problem, theoretical problem, is in this sense, it's not psychoanalytic, is that for us, the existence of the unconscious, something beyond us that we can't control, the existence of the unconscious means that there's always a conflict between what we immediately experience, what we're conscious of, and what lies beyond us. So that continual conflict between the unconscious and consciousness cannot be healed, and the unconscious is a contradictory, divided phenomenon. And Jung and Jungians don't take that seriously. So apart from the political problems with Jung, which are not accidental, I think, there are also these conceptual problems, which mean that we in no way want our book to be read as a Jungian book. It's a challenge to Jungians as well as anything else.
How about you, David? What?
Yes, I agree with this completely. The right-wing orientation and all the Jungian method allows ideology, and the worst kind of ideology, to penetrate into psychoanalysis. There is a kind of freedom of interpretation that allows an instrumentalization, ideological instrumentalization of psychoanalysis. And yes, I agree with everything.
I would also like to add, since David has reminded me about interpretation, is that for Jungians, in their training, they learn about the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And because they think they have a superior knowledge of this collective unconscious, it again gives them a license in the clinic to interpret what people are saying, to interpret the meanings of their dreams, and to try and point to these archetypes. And that process of interpretation as something that is given by the analyst to the patient, I think, is completely the opposite of good psychoanalysis. Our conception of psychoanalysis, which we retrieve from the history of debates from before the Second World War and then afterwards in many different countries, our conception of psychoanalysis is that it is the patient who does the analysis. The analyst listens in the clinic very carefully and draws attention to hesitations and repetitions, deviations, draws attention to those things without spelling out the meaning and without educating the patient as to what they really mean. So it's up to the patient themselves to come in and speak. And the process, the curative process of psychoanalysis, is a process of speaking, of putting things into words and noticing connections between things that have never been heard before as they've spoken of these things. So the technical term that we use in psychoanalysis for the patient is the analysand, because it is the analysand who is doing the analyzing, not the analyst.
Yeah. And before we go to look at the other concepts that you explore in the book, maybe we go back to the title or the description itself, where what you've given us is a manifesto. Why a manifesto? Why not any other type of book?
I think because it's, I would say it's a manifesto because it has an urgent appeal to people to take these ideas seriously and to work through the ideas in practice. So it sets out a series of points, a series of arguments that we believe need to be taken seriously and discussed by people who are involved in activist politics of different kinds, liberation politics of different kinds. So it has this form of a manifesto as something that is a political argument, an urgent political argument about how we need psychoanalysis of this kind today. That's my conception of a manifesto.
How about you, David?
Yes, I would only add that it is to make clear that it is not a psychoanalysis book for psychoanalysts. It is not an academic book. It is not a manual, general book with psychoanalytical concepts, but it is a political standpoint positioning that we want to express. And this is why we called it manifesto. We want to manifest something political.
And just again, going back to the title, Psychoanalysis and Revolution, and focusing on revolution for a bit. In your view, what is revolution? And yeah, and what are the preconditions of revolution? Is revolution possible?
I think revolution is possible, and we've seen it attempted time and time again in the world. Revolution is a transformation of social relationships that transgresses and overthrows relations of power. And because we're Marxists, we mainly think about class power and the ownership of the means of production. But what we see in revolutions in practice is that transformation is much more far-reaching than that, and includes a transformation of gender relations, questions of sexuality, very importantly, questions of coloniality and the liberation of subject peoples subject to imperial control. So it's a radical transformation that gives agency to people who are normally made passive and simply treated as objects. And it gives collective agency to people as they start to take charge of their own lives, as they start to seize the means of production, but not only the means of economic production, to seize the forms of living that have oppressed them so far, and to take charge of those forms of living so that they become the active agents in determining how they should live, how we should all live collectively. Now, I think we can see experiments of that kind throughout history. A rebellion against capitalism, for example, in 1917 in Russia, where the Russian Revolution included liberation of women, a liberation of colonial peoples. It was temporary, in my opinion. It was a transitory, failed experiment, and it failed for a number of reasons that we can analyze, to do with the mistakes of the political leadership, but also, crucially, the intervention by 21 different armies from 14 different surrounding hostile capitalist states that were intent on crushing that revolution. And in a way, they succeeded. They succeeded in distorting it and turning those first few years of experimentation and liberation into something that became a disaster for the people of Russia and for the other countries, the countries that were controlled by Russia. And I think we can see a similar process happening throughout other revolutions. What we see in revolutions is a hope for change being enacted, and we see it happening again and again and again. And you can see what happens when people who are on the edge of losing power respond through a series of military dictatorships and coups and reactionary appeals to nationality, fascist kind of appeals to nationality, to ethnic difference. We see that again and again. But revolution is something, this is an idea that we keep alive, and an example that we keep alive, remembering these attempts.
How about you, David?
Yes. The problem with the question about the possibility of revolution is that, well, first, most revolutions, and the most important revolutions, the ones that deserve the name of revolutions in the history of the world, were seen as impossible before happening. This is the case of the Russian Revolution, of the Red One, and of the French Revolution, the bourgeois revolution of 1789. And anyone imagined that a revolution was possible, and it was possible, finally. And the second thing is that the function of revolutions are precisely the main function, I think, of a revolution as a radical transformation is to make what was impossible, to turn it into something real. What is impossible ceases to be, is not more impossible after a revolution. So Ian and I believe in the revolution. This is clear. It is true that revolution seems impossible, but this is not a reason for it to not happen. And in a certain way, yes, it is impossible in the reality we live, but precisely a revolution wants to change this reality. The problem here, for me, it's not its impossibility, but the reality that makes revolution impossible. That the only possible thing is capitalism with its inequalities, with its wars, with its destruction of human culture, and with its devastation of the planet, of the earth, that will irremediably cause the annihilation of humanity. Why is the end of the world the only possible thing? Why those preserving the world and humanity, which is now only possible with a revolution, seem impossible to us? These questions can be addressed with some tools that psychoanalysis provides us. This is part of what we do in the manifesto.
So maybe what we do next is we look at some of the points that you mentioned in the manifesto, where you talk about the tension between adaptation, subversion, and resistance. You know, what should people do with those stressors, that pain or the illness that makes them seek therapy? What should they do with it? And I'm asking this question in the context of an environment such as this one, where we are living, where I don't know. What are your thoughts?
We're both hesitating. Okay, I think we have to be open here that there is a paradox in the argument that we're making about psychoanalysis, and the paradox is that in order to recover our sense of agency as human beings, we have to be able to speak and reflect about the forms of distress that we experience. And we have to do that in a collective way. We have to be able to share those experiences in order to work out what forces are preventing us from realizing ourselves and to confront those forces. And the paradox is that psychoanalysis is a clinical attempt, a clinical procedure. It sets up a clinical space, which is usually a space in which someone is extracted from the social relations that they're part of and speaks in this confined space to one other person. Now, in the book, we talk a little bit towards the end about group analysis, and we talk about collective processes. But psychoanalysis at its heart is concerned with a one-to-one space in which people have the opportunity to speak about things they've never spoken about before, because it is a secure space. It's a safe space in which they can speak to another person, where they won't be judged, where they won't be told that what they're saying is wrong. Also where the psychoanalyst won't agree with them, with what they say, like a friend does. A friend agrees with you, and it prevents you often from being able to go further in your reflection, to turn those reflections into critical reflections that you own as your own reflections. So that's the paradox. And so what we're doing is taking some of the key ideas from psychoanalysis in its clinical treatment, the unconscious and the drive and repetition, looking at the ways in which those are worked through in the transference, that is inside the clinic. We're taking those ideas and looking at how they can be useful to think about subjectivity critically, to think about who we are critically outside the clinic in the political movements. So we can find some uses of those ideas outside the movements. So there's a kind of double focus here in the book, a political process that operates at two levels. It operates inside the clinic, where we think about how the clinic is operating to divide people from each other and individualizing distress. So we think about how the clinic can open up, be more open to politics, and how we psychoanalysts can think politically about why certain issues are being spoken about in the clinic. And for that, we need an understanding of racism and sexism and colonialism and capitalism and alienation, all of those things. And outside the clinic, to think about the impact of these ideas in political practice. So that's the paradox that we're dealing with, I think, which is can't be resolved, but we have to be open about what that paradox is as we take forward psychoanalysis and try and make it engage with politics.
Thank you. How about you, David?
Yes, the difference between the private problems that we can deal with in the clinic and the public problems that we deal with in the streets is part of the problem also, and we conceive this as part of the problem. An advantage of the Lacanian perspective in psychoanalysis, and I would say of the Freudian expression of psychoanalysis, is that the most intimate in the subject, the most deep bound problems are also exterior, are social, are recognized as social, political, historical. So we are aware in the manifesto that this link that we want to reestablish between social, political movements, organizations, and the personal, individual suffering is already there. It disappeared only because of a political broad political strategy in our society, which is part of class society, of division of work, of capitalism, and also of patriarchy and colonialism. Individual problems are social political problems. In many cases, it's very clear that the suffering of the subject is caused by capitalism, patriarchy, race, reality. In other cases, it is not so clear, but this does not mean that we can think of these problems abstracting them from the whole problematic in which they are produced in the subject. I would only like to say this.
Yeah, I would like to add something about the two sides of the process. One is in the clinic, where we have to rethink how the clinic is working and take seriously the attempts to make the clinic free and available to people, rather than being a middle class endeavor that people have to pay for, which is the way that psychoanalysis has turned out in many countries of the world. And we can think through the clinic in practice in that way by connecting it with communist politics in different initiatives. One is something called the Red Clinic. I do all of my clinical work now through the Red Clinic, and the Red Clinic is a collective of communist mental health workers that makes psychoanalysis available, and in which we think about our politics and the ways in which we bring our politics into the clinic and reflect critically on that. I think the problem is that most mainstream psychoanalysts think that they're not being political, but they import ideas from outside politics into the clinic because they don't engage with politics. That is, they unwittingly, unconsciously bring in those political prejudices and ideas about gender and sexuality and race, etc., etc. So there's that project of the Red Clinic, which connects with other similar projects in different parts of the world. We have strong contacts with comrades in Brazil, for example, working in equivalent places like the Red Clinic, versions of the Red Clinic. The other side of the question is difficult as well. And I'm very wary about using psychoanalysis as a kind of worldview or a master key that will unlock things in politics. and very wary about applying psychoanalysis to politics. And I know that David is also wary about this. And what we offer in the book are ways of using psychoanalytic ideas in a flexible, open way to enable political debate rather than interpret it. We're not telling people that what they're really doing is this or that unconscious process, but we're opening a debate about the ways in which political organizations operate according to a certain structure, for example, which is often not reflected on and operates as an unconscious structure, and the ways in which that unconscious structure of the political organization leads the organization to repeat certain mistakes over and over again, and the ways in which that repetitive drive of the organization inhibits and sabotages what the activists really want to do. So we take some ideas about the unconscious and repetition and the drive, and we connect them with similar political ideas emerging from feminist theory, for example, from the liberation movements, to question politics itself and political organization.
You also speak of the individual and the subject, and also the private and the public, or the privatization, individualization of distress. Can you say something more about this? Can you?
Well, it's a process that starts way before the globalization of capitalism in the world, in which people are made to feel that they have to compete with others, that's the only way in which they'll be able to survive. And that individualization of experience under capitalism actually is part of the basis for the development of psychoanalysis itself. We have to notice that. But in that individualization and competitivism increases in times of neoliberalism. So the kind of world that we're living in at the moment, neoliberal capitalism, consists of an intensification of individualism, in which people are made to take responsibility for their health, for their education, for their livelihoods, looking after their families and those they care for. And that goes alongside the destruction of welfare state services, welfare provision, the destruction of those welfare provision, including the provision of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy in the National Health Service. We're seeing the National Health Service in Britain, for example, being destroyed, and the forms of therapeutic support that were offered in the National Health Service, which included psychoanalysis, we're seeing that stripped away and people made to pay for their treatment, including psychological treatment. And there's a third aspect of neoliberalism that is also extremely important and often overlooked, which is that at the same time as the welfare state is destroyed, the security apparatus or the police apparatus of the state is increased. So there are more and more sanctions, more and more impact on people to make them conform, to make them individuals, and to punish them if they step out of line, if they start to behave collectively, if they start to think collectively. So we have an intensification of the main problems of capitalism, which we have to deal with today as we argue for a collective agency of people, and to see psychoanalysis as an important step. And it's only a step okay, to see psychoanalysis as an important step to helping people feel a sense of agency and feel that they actually have a right to take charge of their own lives and to take charge of their lives collectively with other people when they come out of the clinic and they engage in political action.
Yes, David.
About the individualization and privatization of stress, as Mark Fisher calls it, it can, our attempt to put psychoanalysis or some psychoanalytical tools at the service of liberation movements can be seen as part of this privatization of the stress, of individualization. It can be seen as a psychologization of political problems, and it can be dangerous to put psychology into liberation movements. But our strategy with Ian is to take psychology is already there in social movements. Psychology is everywhere in the world, and it has many negative effects in social mobilizations that have been denounced many decades ago by feminists like Selma James, and many social movements have been even internally destroyed by this psychologization. So once there is psychology in society which contributes to the individualization, privatization, and depolitization of movements, we can take a kind of psychology that is overcome by itself. In the psychoanalytic concepts that we use in the manifesto take to politics, to arrive through psychology, through psychoanalysis, to finally arrive to the social public space. They don't, they are like ways that don't go to psychology, to the inner world of the individual, but to the outer world of the political, social conflicts. Because the unconscious is exterior, because the drives are also cultural and part of culture, because repression cannot be separated from political dimensions, and so on, and so on. So this moves departs from psychology to go beyond psychology to the public social sphere. I think this is our strategy. And in the other sense, to take politics into the clinic, we can be accused by traditional psychoanalysts to violate a fundamental principle of psychoanalysis, which is the abstention principle, the neutrality principle. But in fact, it is individualistic psychoanalysis which is violating this principle constantly. Because if we listen to a subject, if we limit ourselves to listen what distress a subject, politics will appear immediately. Most of the problems of any subject are political, social problems. But when the subject begin to speak of politics, of social problems in the psychoanalytical space, psychoanalysts take this as rationalization, as a kind of avoiding the real problems, which are deep private problems. And this is not to respect the neutrality symptom. When I don't make a clinic now, but when I listen, I have to make a clinic for my students. It is one of my functions, 8 hours per week. And when I listen to the students, they are always economic, social, political problems. And my colleagues, which believe in the neutrality principle, will avoid this kind of subjects, because they think to be neutral is to not speak of politics. But it's the contrary, is to speak of what the people wants to speak. It is impossible to not speak of politics, economy. wanted to underline this.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And there is a kind of illusion of neutrality in mainstream psychoanalysis. The psychoanalyst not only imagines that they're being neutral inside the clinic when they are not neutral at all, because they carry their prejudices into the clinic without thinking about them, without a political discussion in supervision and in the training and in the public sphere. Without that, they carry their prejudices into the clinic. And then, worse than that, they imagine that they should keep quiet about political issues when they have a public political role as citizens. And we think that it's really important that psychoanalysts speak out about political issues. This is why, for example, in the Red Clinic, we produced a statement against what Israel is doing, committing genocide in Gaza, and invited psychoanalysts from around the world to sign that statement and to make their position clear. Now, that has political effects inside the clinic as well, because instead of being a neutral, silent person who is complicit with power, you take a position, and that is something that the patient or the analysand inside the clinic can speak about if they want to speak about it, and to argue with if they want to argue, and to come to their own position, to their own realization, their own experience of what it is to be a speaking subject, confronted with these political conflicts.
But is that neutrality? You know, when mass atrocities are happening and you're silent, or when mass atrocities are happening and you, like the speaking subject, sticks to a script provided by the people who are committing the mass atrocities. Is that neutrality?
No, it's not neutrality. It's to take a political position without taking responsibility for that political position. And we believe that a psychoanalyst should also be a publicly visible citizen taking a public position on these political matters against power rather than for power. And there's a tradition of that in psychoanalysis as well that we speak about in the book. As I said, many of the psychoanalysts before the Nazis took power were members or supporters of communist parties or socialist parties. And it's a tragedy what happened to psychoanalysis when it was destroyed in Europe, and when psychoanalysts became frightened of speaking out when they went into exile. But there were exceptions. I'll give you one example very briefly. Marie Langer was a psychoanalyst who was trained in Vienna. Marie Langer had to leave Vienna when the Nazis took power, and she went to Spain, and she fought in the civil war in Spain on the side of the Republicans. Then, when the civil war in Spain failed, when the fascists took power, Marie Langer fled to Argentina, where she was engaged in political discussions as well as clinical discussions, which included discussions with feminist movements, and she changed her position politically around the position of women when she was in exile in Argentina. And then when the Nicaraguan revolution happened, she went to Nicaragua and she worked with the Sandinistas, working with victims of the Contras in Nicaragua, and took a very clear public position there, supporting the Sandinistas and doing clinical work with people affected by the conflict there. She was an inspiration. She was someone who held true to her politics and tried to do clinical work in an ethical way that enabled people to speak inside the clinic about whatever they wanted to speak about, without educating them, without telling them what they should feel, without telling them what they should think, And at the same time, she took a public political position that people could engage with so that they had an idea of who they were going to speak to when they spoke about their distress.
Hmm. And when David comes back in, I don't know if you could also say something about neutrality.
Are you waiting for David to say something about neutrality?
Yeah, when he comes in.
He's
But
just here again now.
Yeah.
Okay, ask him.
Yeah, David, how about you? What are your thoughts on neutrality?
Well, neutrality must be preserved in the clinical sphere, but neutrality is a word, is a concept, a very abstract concept. Neutrality in reality is impossible. But in the clinical space, the psychoanalyst can achieve a sort of materialization of this abstract concept. But in the real life, it is impossible. And in real life, we are not neutral because we are in the real life and we have already a position of privilege or not. I'm a man, I'm a white man, but I'm in the global south. And all these are things that impede any kind of neutrality. We are already not neutral. And then we can position politically in relation to this place that we have in the world. What we call neutrality in the real life outside the clinical context is a political position, and it's generally and conformity, a kind of conformism of acceptation of the main current of the things that are happening. When we don't have a political standpoint concerning what is happening around us, we are accepting what is happening, and this is a political standpoint. It is a political, it is politics of acceptance, of tolerance, it is a kind of conservatism, because we are allowing reality to remain like it is. To not speak of Palestine now is to allow what is happening in Gaza at this moment. We cannot be neutral. And the psychoanalysts that remain neutral, actually, they are teaching a kind of political conservatism to those analysts that take them as an example. The ideal thing is that they don't take them as an example, but it happens sometimes, and it's unavoidable, and they are teaching something to them. I would only add this. Thank you.
So the next question that I'm going to, carry on. Carry on. Oh, I was going to say that the next question I'm going to ask is going to be to ask for your reflections on what psychoanalysis and revolution can teach human rights activists, community activists, and others. But before we go to that question, maybe we turn to the people who are listening in. Do any of you have questions, comments? If you do, if you unmute, that would be great. You can unmute and just speak to your questions.
Hello?
Hello. Hi, Emeka.
Yep. So I just have a question to both Ian Parker. Ian Parker, I adore you. I have to be honest. And I'm here I'm in Nottingham. I'm the colonial scholar in Nottingham Trent University. So I follow your work and I appreciate your contributions. So my question is about decoloniality. Now that we know that the individualistic life ways does not really help us understand our social problems, and it does not help us to address the social problems that are mostly political, and that psychology, as a capitalist discipline, is centered on, the market or commodification of pathology. So what do we do as psychologists to decolonize this concept of individualism that perverts our understanding of the woman?
Maybe we also take two more. I think, Kerry, you have a comment in the comments. Maybe if you could speak to your question. And also, Dango, you've got a comment. Maybe if you could also unmute and just,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just asked the question. This is really fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm interested in the role of psychoanalysis in contemporary social movements from a very grounded, practical sense. So, and I can hear the resistance to kind of be applying concepts or trying to be heavy-handed in that approach. So maybe a little bit more on what you were saying about how you would work with organizations, maybe in terms of thinking through and debating in the ways that Ian was talking about earlier. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Shall I go as well?
I think we've got one more. Who's this? Dango?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I was just wondering, and I put in the question as well. I joined late, so please ignore this if it's already been covered. And apologies for joining late. But I was wondering where your work relates to the work of other Marxist psychoanalysts, or in that tradition, such as Erich Fromm, Wilhelm Reich, and as well as to the anti-psychiatry movement associated with R.D. Laing. Where would you kind of situate your work with these people? Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for those questions, and there's really a lot to get through in those. So I'll try and be brief, but I'll try and answer. Around the question of the decolonial move, Emeka, I would see this as crucial in questioning what is happening in psychology inside the psychological institutions, and enabling people to mobilize independently outside the psychological institutions. So I know that there's a lot of very good critical decolonial work going on by critical psychologists inside psychology. And I think we need to be able to support that work, but we need to do it without putting all our eggs in that basket, without putting our hopes in psychology being able to reform itself. Because when it comes down to it, I think it's not a problem only of the mistaken ideas of psychology, but it's the very structure of psychology itself that is the problem. Psychology emerged as a discipline in the end of the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, at the same time as capitalism. And it did so for a very good reason, because it was a tool of surveillance and control, of specifying what good behavior was and how you should think. And so I think when it comes down to it, it's important to support the reform movements, the decolonial movements, for example, in psychology, but not to believe that that will be possible and that you can end up with a nice, good, progressive psychology at the end of it. We need to operate independently outside the institutions. Our decolonial work has to be a decolonial work that is empowering us all to operate independently of the institutions. To turn to Kerry's question about the social movements, I think one example is to emphasize analysis that is already taking place. And I'm thinking here of just one example of the work of the anarchist feminist writer Jo Freeman, who pointed to the phenomenon of the tyranny of structuralistness in organizations. That is, in a lot of left organizations, there's a kind of illusion that everybody is free and able to speak freely, and there's a kind of horizontal kind of playing field, whereas in fact, there are lots of power structures that are still operating, that privileges white people, that privileges men over women, that privileges those with a certain kind of education and expertise to be able to speak. And those who are not privileged are on the outside and end up doing practical tasks. We notice this time and again in left organizations. So that's an unconscious assumption that is operating. It's unconscious, it's not deliberate and explicit. Even the white men who are in control of those organizations, often they don't intend to do that. They want to do something different, but something unconscious is driving the process, repetitively leading to that organization doing the same thing and repeating and intensifying power relations. So we connect with the work of Jo Freeman and argue that there's something psychoanalytic in her argument that we can draw attention to. There's something really valuable in the argument that we can take further by thinking of the role of psychoanalysis in it. Thirdly, and this is very difficult to answer quickly, but I will do it, to say that Erich Fromm was an attempt to connect with Marxism. We value that attempt, and we want to work through that attempt and debate with followers of Erich Fromm. Wilhelm Reich was a key figure in the development of the free clinics in Vienna and Berlin and Budapest, arguing, pushing Freud to take the free clinic movement seriously. And we take Reich's work very seriously as well as an attempt to connect Marxism and psychoanalysis. And R.D. Laing as well, before he became more conservative and looked to the family as a little enclosed space that would protect people and all that kind of thing. Laing as well, trained as a psychoanalyst, and there are some important ideas in Laing in engaging with the person as a human being and as a subject instead of treating them as an object. I'm sorry my answer has been long to these three questions, but you asked for it.
About the first question on decolonization, yes, I agree. We need to decolonize psychology. For my part, I'm studying since 3 or 4 days the indigenous conceptions of subjectivity in Mexico. This is a way to decolonize psychology in Mexico, in my country. But at the same time, I would like to say that what we call the colonial thinking in Latin America is sometimes, not always, very conservative, and it is not involved in political radical movements. This is why sometimes we prefer to call ourselves anti-colonial than decolonial, to put a distance from people who is in the academia, mainly in United States, Latin American people who works in the United States, like Mignolo, whose standpoints are not always very radical. And there is another problem with the colonial thinking. It is that they assume sometimes, not always, that we can get rid of coloniality as if it was an academic decision, but it is not like this. We are already colonized people. We are already part of Europe, and we are crossed by the problems of Europe. This is a struggle, and an historical struggle, and it would be very stupid to renounce to the weapons that European thought can give us to struggle against a political kind of power, and also of in the epistemological space. Against in relation to the second question, I would like to focus on one point: the fact of applying concepts in social movements. And yes, we are against the application of concepts. Different concepts that we use in the book are eminently social and political concepts, most of them that must be defined by the social movements and political organizations themselves. Yeah, and we do not want to convert these concepts into psychological concepts, as many psychologists do. The psychologists transform political concepts into psychological concepts to snatch the definition of those concepts from the people, from the social movements and political organization. It is in the social and political world that these concepts must be defined. I think their definition is part of the social and political struggle. This struggle is prevented and neutralized by academics, specialists who claim to know the true meaning of things and who are sometimes too conservative, imposing this conservatism when defining things, thus imposing it on society and politics. Our book doesn't do that. It is not a book of definitions or other solutions or recipes that we tend to impose and apply to social movements. And finally, about the third question on Fromm, Reich, Fanon, and psychiatry, these are comrades. We have sometimes differences, conceptual, theoretical differences, but I think we are in the same political front, and we have learned a lot of them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Emeka, Kerry, and Dango, do you want to come back in?
No, that was great for me.
That was very, very great. And thank you very much for the explanation. I'm very satisfied. Thank you. I was just about to write my thank you on the chat before you called us in. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
How about you, Dango?
Yeah, thanks. It was interesting answers. And I see Ian has answered on the chat my little follow-up addendum to my question, which is I said I should have also mentioned Frantz Fanon. But I see Ian has responded to that. So it's obviously up to you guys if you want to add anything there. But yeah, thank you for your answers and your time.
I'd just like to say that on Fanon, you should look at a book called Psychoanalysis Under Occupation by Lara and Stephen Shihai. It's an absolutely fantastic, thoroughly Fanonian book about practicing psychoanalysis in Palestine.
Thank you. And coming back to Emeka and also Kerry and Dango, how would you answer your own questions?
That's why I was asking it, was really because I had no sense. I'm coming from an activist context and as a historian. So for me, it's really coming with my activist hat on tonight to understand how in our own organizing around anti-racism and policing, we can apply some of this within our work. So the answers to my questions about application were really helpful. And now I'm just excited, honestly, to read the book and think through a little more some of the questions you're raising about issues we could discuss within our organizations that might lead to greater awareness of how we could reproduce certain power dynamics within the groups that we're working into. That turning it around into internal self-reflection as a group, I think was helpful for me, and I'm going to look more into reading about that. So thank you.
Okay, if I should come in, my thesis is based on decolonizing the psychology curriculum, and I found it very intriguing that we run around this concept of decolonization without actually going to confront the issue of capitalism, because everything is centered around commodification. What cannot be sold is no knowledge. So no matter how useful a knowledge is, if it cannot be converted into European logic and be sold to people as a commodity, it is always denigrated and said, this is rubbish or is superstition, whatever they use to make sure that it doesn't come out. So my question, or if I should attempt an answer, because I didn't have an answer, that's why I asked the question. If I should attempt an answer, which leads to nothing anyway, because it's, why are we dancing around this issue of the political? Why are we not confronting this issue of capitalism and what it does? Not capitalism, eradicating capitalism per se, but questioning its negative impact and the ideologies of destroying family and societies that make it difficult for us to mobilize. Because the individualistic life way that is encouraged is an ideology that says we are agentic, we take responsibility for everything, we are this, we are that. We know that that is not true. We live in a society. Society impacts us, we impact society. So that's just my own attempt at rambling. So I don't know how far I'm able to answer my own question, but yeah, that's the dilemma in writing my thesis that I confronted, and these are questions that still follow me. I don't know the answers to them. So if we are not willing to talk about capitalism because we are afraid of losing our jobs, because we are afraid of whatever, I don't think we are really going to decolonize.
Yeah, sure.
How about you, Django?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I love all the people that I referenced there, Fanon and Reich and Fromm and so on, and Lang as well. And it seemed very, and the reason I'm here with you all tonight, it's always seemed clear to me really that you know, quote unquote individual psychological emotional emancipation or whatever is not feasible without challenging political and economic structures and so on, and not even intelligible without relating to them. And at the same time, and this has become more clear to me over the past year, engaging in a kind of a community squat, really quite an intense community squat over several weeks, where it was kind of it's very liberating, but at the same time, and this was referenced earlier as well, about how you reproduce, you know, the privileges and so on in a quote unquote free space. And it became very, you know, that kind of, we're so unused, what it made me realize, we're so unused to any kind of freedom really in this society, that you kind of have a little bit, and immediately all of our sort of repressed and not understood, not dealt with psychological issues and so on immediately come to the fore and start disrupting everything. And so yeah, that really brought to the fore again for me how the political emancipation can't go forward as well without actually dealing with the inner work and so on. So I've always been interested in that relationship, and it's a long time since I read those people I referenced, but I always felt that they were onto something very important. So I'm looking forward to reading your contribution as well. Yeah, I don't know if that answers my own question, but that's some of the thought behind it.
Thank you very much, Django. And then now we turn to our speakers for the last question. Ian and David, what can psychoanalysis and revolution teach community activists, human rights defenders, and others? And we end on that note. And also on your hopes.
Well, I think the answer is that we cannot. We cannot teach them anything. We're urging them to think and to argue and to take these ideas and to see if they're useful. That's as far as we go, I think.
How about you, David?
Yes, I agree with Ian. Perhaps what we teach is that nobody can teach anything to the others. It's what Freire also in liberation pedagogy was teaching, that it is a collective knowledge that is put together by all people who participate in the transformation of the world, and we are simple parts of these people, and each person can contribute with something. But for knowledge to be complete knowledge, it needs all the points of view. Rosa Luxemburgo knew very well this, a knowledge that come from a schoolmaster, as Marx called them, and after Rosa Luxemburgo, has not truth in itself. I think we can learn a lot from social movement, much more than we can learn from an individual. For example, the pro-Palestinian protests now are teaching a lot to us. They are teaching the truth of the European, American, and Israeli politics, where some lives are less valuable than other, where human lives don't mind at all. And we can really learn things if we listen with attention to what social movements, protests are teaching us. But there are collectives, there are many peoples. Alone, we cannot go very far.
And on that note, please, I invite you to join me in thanking Ian Parker and David Pavon-Cuellar, authors of Psychoanalysis and Revolution. And this event, this conversation is taking place as part of the Leicester Human Rights Arts and Film Festival, which runs from the 4th until the 10th of December each year. What we've done this year is we've done things slightly differently, where we are running a slow festival and are hosting an event a month in the lead up to the main festival itself in December. And as part of that, our focus is we are calling for ceasefires around the world. I think too many people have died. Too many people have died. Too many people are dying. And we are also drawing attention to the crime of genocide. So join us on Facebook, Twitter, favorite social media platform, and let's see what we can do together. And again, on that note, I say thank you, and peace in the Middle East.
Peace in Britain.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambrose, for the invitation and for organizing this. And thank you to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Ian.